There's a photograph that shouldn't exist. Taken in 1908, somewhere in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky, it shows 11 children standing in front of a limestone building with bars on the windows. Their ages range from maybe 5 to 14. What makes the photograph impossible to forget isn't the building, or the bars, or even the haunted stillness in their faces. It's their eyes. Every single child is staring directly into the camera with an expression that doesn't belong to childhood. They look like they've seen the end of something. And in a way, they had. The building behind them was called the Blackthorn Ridge Home for Wayward Youth. But the children who lived there, the ones who survived it, never called it a home. They called it the Ridge. And for over 3 decades, it existed in a kind of bureaucratic shadow, a place where children were sent and rarely spoken of again. Not because they died, though some did, but because the families who sent them there wanted to forget. The state wanted to forget, and by the time anyone thought to ask questions, the building had been burned to the ground and the records had vanished. This is not a ghost story. This is not folklore. This is the documented, quietly buried history of a place that should never have been allowed to exist, and the children whose childhoods were stolen inside it. The ones who lived long enough to tell their stories did so in whispers, in fragments, in testimony that was never meant to reach the public. But it did, piece by piece, name by name, and what they described wasn't just neglect, it wasn't just cruelty. It was something more deliberate, something that had a system, a philosophy, a name. They called it reformation. But what happened at Blackthorn Ridge was annihilation, of identity, of innocence, of the belief that someone somewhere might come to save you. And the worst part, most of the children sent there weren't criminals, they weren't violent, they were just inconvenient, too loud, too poor, too broken by what had already been done to them. So their families, their churches, their counties made them disappear. And in 1908, 11 of them stood in front of a camera and stared into a lens like they were staring into a grave. Because in a way they were. This is their story, and it starts long before that photograph was ever taken. Hello everyone, before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Blackthorn Ridge was founded in 1891 by a man named Cornelius Thatcher. He was a former school administrator, a deacon in the Baptist church, and by all public accounts, a man of moral conviction. He believed that children were not born innocent. He believed they were born with sin already rooted deep in their bones, and that without intervention, without correction, they would grow into something monstrous. He wrote about this extensively in letters and pamphlets distributed throughout rural Kentucky. He called it the doctrine of preemptive salvation, and what it meant, in practice, was this: if you could break a child early enough, you could rebuild them into something righteous. The ridge was built on 40 acres of donated land, far enough from the nearest town that no one had to hear what went on there. It was funded through a combination of church donations, county contracts, and private families who paid to have their children taken in. The children came from all over eastern Kentucky, southern Ohio, and parts of West Virginia. Some were orphans. Some had parents who simply couldn't afford to keep them. Others had been labeled defiant or strange or morally suspect. There was a girl named Ida Mae Krause, 9 years old, who was sent there because she refused to speak after her mother died. There was a boy named Thomas Harlan, 12, who was sent because he stole bread. Another boy, name unknown, was omitted because a local preacher said he had the devil's eyes. Once they arrived, they were given new names. Not nicknames, new legal identities. The records show this clearly. A child named Sarah would become Patience. A boy named James would become Steadfast. It was part of Thatcher's philosophy. The old self had to be erased before the new one could be built. And so these children, some as young as 4 years old, were stripped of the only thing they had left: their own names, their own sense of who they were. The daily schedule at Blackthorn Ridge was brutal in its simplicity. Wake at 4:30 in the morning, 2 hours of scripture memorization before breakfast. Breakfast was cornmeal mush, sometimes with a piece of salted pork if the week's donations had been good. Then work. The boys hauled limestone from a nearby quarry. The girls worked the laundry, the kitchen, the sewing room. All of it in silence. Speaking without permission was punishable. Laughing was punishable. Looking another child in the eye for too long was punishable. And punishment at the Ridge wasn't just physical. Thatcher believed in what he called reflective suffering. A child who misbehaved would be placed in a small stone room beneath the main building, with no light, no sound, and no sense of time. Some children were kept there for days. One boy, according to later testimony, was kept there for 2 weeks. When he came out, he couldn't remember his name, not the one he was born with, not the one they gave him. He couldn't remember anything, By 1895, Blackthorn Ridge housed over 60 children, and not a single inspector had ever set foot inside. The silence around Blackthorn Ridge wasn't accidental, it was structural. In the 1890s, there was no federal oversight of institutions like this. Child welfare didn't exist as a concept. The few state laws that did exist were vague, underfunded, and rarely enforced. If a child was sent to a private reform home by their family or their church, the state had no legal obligation to follow up. The child simply ceased to exist in any official capacity. And that's exactly what happened. Over and over again, there are letters, dozens of them, stored in county archives, in church basements, in the personal collections of historical societies. Letters from parents asking about their children. Letters from siblings who hadn't heard anything in years. Letters from pastors requesting updates, and the responses, when there were any, were identical. Your child is being reformed. Your child is being saved. Your child is no longer your concern. One mother, a woman named Beatrice Lowell, wrote 16 letters over the course of 3 years asking to visit her daughter. She was told repeatedly that visitation would interfere with the reformation process. When she finally traveled to Blackthorn Ridge in person, she was turned away at the gate. She never saw her daughter again. But there were cracks, small ones. A local school teacher named Margaret Poole began asking questions in 1902 after a boy showed up in her one-room schoolhouse with scars on his back that looked like brands. He wouldn't say where he came from. He wouldn't say his name. But another child whispered it to her later, the Ridge. She wrote to the county. She wrote to the state. She wrote to the governor's office. No one responded. So she did something else. She started keeping a journal. Every time a child appeared in town with that same hollow look in their eyes, she wrote it down. Every rumor, every whispered story, every name she could find. By 1907, she had over 40 entries, and she had become convinced that something deeply, fundamentally wrong was happening up on that ridge. In the fall of 1907, a fire broke out in the quarry where the boys worked. 3 children were killed. Their names, according to Thatcher's records, were Faithful, Resolute, and Temperance. Their real names were never recorded. Their families were never notified. They were buried in unmarked graves on the property, and the incident was reported to the county as an unfortunate accident. But one of the boys who survived the fire, a child named Peter Gaskill, escaped 2 weeks later. He walked 11 miles barefoot through the woods until he reached the town of Harlan. And when someone finally got him to talk, he told them everything. He told them about the silence, the rooms, the punishments. He told them about children who stopped eating, who stopped moving, who just stood in place until someone dragged them away. He told them about the night Thatcher gathered all the children in the chapel and told them that their old lives were a sin, that their families had abandoned them because they were broken, and that the only way to be whole again was to forget they had ever been anyone else. And he told them about the 3 boys who died in the fire, how they had been chained to the quarry wall as punishment for talking during scripture, how when the fire started, no one unlocked them, how they screamed until they couldn't anymore. Peter Gaskill's testimony was taken seriously for about 48 hours. Then Cornelius Thatcher arrived in town with a lawyer, a letter from a judge, and a signed affidavit from Peter's father stating that the boy was a known liar and a disturbance. Peter was returned to Blackthorn Ridge. He was never seen again. The photograph from 1908, the one with the 11 children, was taken by a traveling photographer named Edwin Marsh. He had been hired by Thatcher to document the success of the institution, to create images that could be used in fundraising materials and church bulletins. Marsh spent 3 days at Blackthorn Ridge. He took dozens of photographs, buildings, classrooms, the chapel, the dormitories, and on the final day he gathered the children for a group portrait. He later said it was the most disturbing assignment of his career, not because of what he saw, but because of what he didn't see. No one smiled, no one moved. When he asked them to look at the camera, they did, but their eyes didn't focus. They looked through him, past him, like they were looking at something only they could see. Marsh kept one copy of that photograph for himself. He never used it professionally. He never showed it to anyone, but he wrote about it in a letter to his brother in 1912. He said the children looked like they had already died, and someone had just forgotten to bury them. He said he still saw their faces when he closed his eyes, and he said that if there was a place in this world where evil wore the mask of righteousness, he had found it. By 1910, Blackthorn Ridge had begun to change, not because of external pressure, not because of investigation or reform, but because Cornelius Thatcher was dying. He had developed tuberculosis, and by all accounts he refused treatment. He believed his suffering was holy. He believed God was testing him. And in the final months of his life he became erratic. Former staff members, the few who later agreed to speak, said he would wander the halls at night, reciting scripture, weeping, calling out names of children who were no longer there. Some said he was repenting. Others said he was descending into madness. But the children, the ones who were still alive, said something else. They said he was afraid, that for the first time in his life, Cornelius Thatcher understood what he had done, and it terrified him. He died in February of 1911, and within 6 months Blackthorn Ridge began to collapse. The funding dried up, the staff left, the church that had supported it for 20 years quietly distanced itself, and the children, the ones who remained, were scattered. Some were sent to other institutions, some were returned to families who barely recognized them, and some, according to incomplete records, simply disappeared. No forwarding address, no documentation. Just names that stopped appearing in any official record after 1911. Margaret Poole, the schoolteacher who had been keeping the journal, tried to track them down. She spent years writing letters, visiting courthouses, searching for any trace of the children who had passed through Blackthorn Ridge. She found 12 out of more than 200 children who had been admitted between 1891 and 1911. Some had changed their names, some refused to speak about it, but a very few, told her what they remembered, and what they told her was worse than anything she had imagined. They didn't just talk about the physical abuse, the starvation, the isolation. They talked about the erasure, the feeling that they had been hollowed out, that the person they used to be had been taken away and nothing had been put back. One woman, who had been sent to the Ridge at age 7 and released at 15, told Poole that she still couldn't remember her mother's face. She said Thatcher had made them repeat every single day that their families were strangers. That love was a distraction. That memory was a sin. And after years of hearing it, she said, it became true. In 1918, the Blackthorn Ridge building burned down. No one knows how the fire started. No investigation was ever conducted. By the time anyone noticed, it had already burned to the foundation, and with it went the records, the files, the names. For decades, Blackthorn Ridge existed only in fragments, a mention in a county ledger, a faded photograph in a family album, a story passed down through generations too dark to be repeated in full. But in 1976, something changed. A historian named Dr. Eleanor Vance was researching institutional abuse in Appalachia for her dissertation, and she came across Margaret Poole's journal in a church archive in Harlan County. It had been donated after Poole's death in 1954, and no one had looked at it since. Vance spent the next 8 years tracking down every lead in that journal. She found descendants of children who had been sent to the Ridge. She found county records that had somehow survived. She found letters, photographs, and testimony that had been buried in courthouse basements and historical society collections. And in 1984, she published her findings in a book titled The Erasure, Children of Blackthorn Ridge. It was not a bestseller. It was published by a small academic press and sold fewer than 3,000 copies. But for the families who read it, for the descendants who had grown up hearing whispers about a place their grandparents refused to name, it was a revelation. Suddenly, the silence had a shape. The shame had a source, and the children who had been erased finally had their names spoken aloud again. Vance's book listed every name she could verify. Every child she could confirm had been sent to Blackthorn Ridge. It was 63 names, 63 out of more than 200. The rest were lost, not dead necessarily, just lost, erased so completely that even their existence had become a question mark. One of the descendants who read that book was a man named Carl Denton. His grandmother had been sent to Blackthorn Ridge in 1903. When she was 8 years old, she never spoke about it, not once. But Carl had found a photograph in her belongings after she died. It was the same photograph Edwin Marsh had taken in 1908, the 11 children. And there in the back row, third from the left, was his grandmother. She couldn't have been more than 13 in that picture. And the look in her eyes, Carl said, explained everything he had never understood about her. The nightmares, the silence, the way she flinched when anyone touched her unexpectedly, the way she refused to let her own children out of her sight. She had spent 70 years carrying something she couldn't name, and now, finally, he knew what it was. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you dig deeper, or would you let it stay buried? Carl Denton wasn't the only one. After Vance's book was published, dozens of people came forward. They wrote letters, they called. They sent photographs and documents and stories their families had kept hidden for generations, and slowly, a picture began to emerge, not just of what happened at Blackthorn Ridge, but of what it meant. These children hadn't just been abused. They had been systematically dehumanized, told over and over that they were broken, that they deserved what was happening to them, that no one was coming to save them because no one wanted them. And for many of them, that belief never went away. Even after they left, even after they grew up and had families of their own, they carried it like a scar that never healed. There's a term for this now. Institutional trauma, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. We understand it better than we did in 1911, but understanding it doesn't undo it. And for the children of Blackthorn Ridge, there was no therapy, no support, no acknowledgement that anything wrong had even happened. They were just expected to move on, to forget, to be grateful they had survived, and most of them tried. They buried it. They stayed silent. And they passed that silence down to their children, who passed it to theirs, until the trauma became a kind of inheritance, unnamed, unspoken, but always there. In 2003, a group of descendants organized the first and only memorial service for the children of Blackthorn Ridge. It was held on the site where the building once stood. The land had changed hands multiple times over the years. It had been farmland, then vacant, then partially reclaimed by the forest. But the foundation was still there. You could still see the outline of the main building, the chapel, the dormitories, and in the back, near where the unmarked graves had been reported, someone had placed a simple wooden cross. It had no names on it, just a date, 1891 to 1911. 20 years, 200 children, and almost no record that any of it had ever happened. 47 people attended that service. Most of them were grandchildren or great-grandchildren of survivors. A few were local historians. One was a journalist. They stood in a circle around that cross and read the names Eleanor Vance had been able to confirm, 63 names. And after each name, someone would say, "We remember you." It wasn't much. It wasn't justice. But it was the first time in nearly a century that anyone had stood on that ground and said out loud that what happened here mattered. That these children mattered. That their suffering wasn't just an unfortunate footnote in history, but a crime that had been covered up, buried, and forgotten on purpose. One woman, a descendant named Rebecca Harmon, spoke about her great-grandmother who had been sent to the ridge at age 6 and released at 14. She said her great-grandmother never learned to read, never married, never had children of her own. She lived with Rebecca's great-great-aunt until she died in 1966, and in all those years, she only spoke about Blackthorn Ridge once. She told her sister that the worst part wasn't the beatings or the starvation or the isolation. The worst part was that they made her believe she deserved it, that she was bad, that something inside her was broken and wrong and needed to be destroyed. And even after she left, even after decades had passed, she still believed it. She still thought of herself as the person they told her she was. Not the person she had been born as. Not the person she might have become. But the hollowed-out thing they had made her. Rebecca said she grew up watching her great-grandmother sit by the window every afternoon, staring out at nothing, and she never understood why. But after reading Eleanor Vance's book, after learning what had happened, she finally understood. Her great-grandmother wasn't looking at anything. She was looking for something, for the little girl she used to be, the one who had been taken from her so long ago that she couldn't even remember what her face looked like. There were other stories that day, so many stories, and what connected all of them was the same thread, loss, not just of childhood, but of self. The children of Blackthorn Ridge hadn't just been abused, they had been erased. And even the ones who survived, even the ones who lived long lives and had families and tried to build something good out of what had been done to them, never fully came back. Part of them stayed on that ridge, in those rooms, in that silence, and it stayed there long after the building was gone. The memorial service ended with a moment of silence. 47 people standing in the ruins of a place that had once been called a home. And in that silence, you could almost feel it. The weight of all those years, all those children, all those names that had been forgotten. It wasn't closure. It wasn't healing. But it was acknowledgement, and sometimes that's all the dead can ask for.